the manner in which humans perceive and the place where cognitive science was coming in realizing the limit of perception, or at least how objects in the world aren't just self-evident, and that there's a process by which we're able to come together, and the way in which the world kind of shows us or manifests to us how it is that we're supposed to inhabit it. So maybe you can start with that and talk a little bit about that.
Okay, so we can hit that from a variety of different perspectives. I mean, the first problem the cognitive scientists really stumbled across, and the AI types who are developing robots, same thing, and the postmodernists, the literary critics, they all ran across this problem at the same time, which was that any reasonably complex environment is susceptible to a near infinite number of interpretations. And so when you hear the postmodernists say things like, well, there's no fixed meaning for a text, which is something they really started to understand, I would say, really in the 1960s, they're actually right. You know, you think about a Shakespearean play or a biblical story, well, how many interpretations are there of Hamlet or of the story of Cain and Abel? Well, there's an indefinite number of interpretations, maybe one for every reader. Now, there's some overlap because we can commonly understand the stories, but, well, if there's that many interpretations, which one's right? And if none of them are right, well, then are none of them right? And is there even any such thing as right in that situation? And so that's the problem with textual analysis. And then in the real world, outside of texts, let's say, every visual scene is incomprehensibly complex. There's an indefinite number of ways of seeing everything. And this is partly why we don't have general purpose robots, is because AI engineers originally believed that the problem of robotics would be the computation of action in the world. But it turned out that the problem of robotics was seeing the world. And that really shocked everyone, because when you look at the world, it's like, well, there it is, you know, no problem. You just open your eyes and bang, there are the objects. And yeah, there are objects. It's like, well, how many of them? Well, you could get lost in the details of this carpet if you were a photorealist painter, you know. You could take just a section of the carpet and it would take you maybe 3 weeks to paint it in a high resolution manner. And even then, you wouldn't have captured anywhere near the detail, and you'd only have done it under one condition of illumination. And that's just a fragment of a visual scene. And so I started to get extremely interested in this problem, which was the problem of attention. How do we reduce the indefinite multiplicity of the potential landscape of perceptions to the self-evident things that we see? And the answer to that turns out to be extremely bizarre. Partly it's well, we don't see objects, we see meaning, and we infer objects, and that's quite the bloody revelation when you start to understand that, because, you know, modern people, atheistic materialist types, they think, well, it's sort of a dead world intrinsically, and you overlay a meaning on top of that, and that's a secondary overlay, because the object perception is primary, and it's not real, the meaning. It's like, that isn't how your brain works. You see meanings. So, for example, with little children, there's an experiment, for example, called a visual cliff. If you take a baby who can crawl and you imagine a table like this, and then another table the same set here, and then a plate of glass between them. If you have the baby crawl towards the visual cliff, the baby will stop. And the reason isn't that the baby sees like an objective pattern and thinks, oh no, I can fall. They see a falling off place. And then maybe they can infer some common objective pattern out of that. But we see meanings. Our primary element of our perception is meaning, mapped right onto our body. And that really upends the whole, in some sense, the whole empirical notion of the way that we act in the world, the whole rationalist enterprise, although less that. And it poses very strange epistemological questions, so that's questions about the theory of knowledge, but also very strange ontological questions. So, for example, if you're a Darwinian, think, okay, well, we evolved to perceive the world in a manner that's accurate enough to ensure our survival. And that's about as accurate as it gets, in some sense, if you're a Darwinian. Well, we perceive the world through stories. Actually, like technically. Well, does that mean that the world is a story? Or if not, what does it mean? And the answer to that is, it's not so obvious. And one thing that has become obvious that Jonathan and I have talked about a lot is that it's clearly the case that we see the world through something that when we describe it is a story. So you prioritize your attention through a structure of value. And you can't see unless you do that. And so that even means that the objective world, and this is something the postmodernists also kind of pointed out, the objective world isn't even so clearly objective, not in the way we thought, because you can't even see objects except through a hierarchy of value. And so we've talked a lot about, well, what that hierarchy of value might be, and you've hit that particularly from a more theological perspective.
Well, one of the surprising things that comes out of it is the idea that we are aiming when we're acting. That is, in the world, when we're moving, when we're doing things, we're always kind of aiming towards the good and avoiding the bad, we could say. And that actually becomes, in a certain manner, the definition of how we perceive objects themselves, right? It's like if I see an apple, without even thinking about it, I'm always asking myself, is it a good apple? Is it an apple that will reach its purpose? And when we say its purpose, it's actually our embodied human purpose. That is, if I see an apple, I'm asking myself, is it good to eat?
Right,
That's
and
then
you're also assuming then there's a Platonic element to that too. So, like, does it fulfill its function as an apple? Which would be, for us, it would be, well, it's ripe and it's not rotten and it's delicious, and then the reason you see it, it's tied into an ethic, and you might say, well, what kind of ethic is it tied in? So it's like, well, do you want to eat? And do you eat because you want to live? And do you want to live because you think living is worthwhile? And to what end are you devoting your life? And you think, well, none of that's there when I see an apple. And that's absolutely 100% wrong. All of that is there when you see everything. And so you're embedded in an ethic of aim, and you can't organize your perceptions with it without that. And that ethic of aim, fundamentally, the highest order aims, or the most fundamental aims, you can use either metaphor, so the most basic things or the highest things, they are phenomenologically religious in structure. And I mean that by definition. So, like, when you talk about the deepest things, and so those would be the things that move you the most, or the things that are your ultimate aim, you're in the landscape that produces religious experiences when people are in that domain. And that's deeply rooted biologically. So one of the religious instincts, for example, is the instinct that's associated with awe and with the compulsion to imitate. So, maybe you imitate a hero, and the ultimate hero would be a divine figure. And so that's why, for example, religious people might talk about the imitation of Christ. But that experience of awe, which you might have when you look up at the night sky, that's associated with piloerection, which is the feeling of your hair standing on end, or chills running up and down your back, which sometimes you'll feel, for example, if you listen to music and you're deeply moved by it. And that is a reflex that's probably 60 million years old, because it's the same reflex that you see a cat when it sees a dog, maybe it's afraid, it puffs itself up. That's piloerection, and does that so it looks big, and then it dances sideways. And it's the experience the cat is having is something like the experience of awe. And that's not cognitive. Like, that's 60 million years old. It's really old. And it's a primary religious experience. And so, and it's tied into perception in an extraordinarily deep level, partly because the things that you're in awe of will be the things towards which you orient your perceptions and your actions at the highest level of organization. And so that's actually what the awe experience in some sense is for, right? It's to show you what is at the top of the structure that directs your attention. And that happens with everything you do.
So in a way, it also becomes a way to understand two aspects of the religious, we could say. One, which is the terrible aspect of it, this idea of this terrifying figure. And the other is the imitative part, right? So you have this notion that the cat sees the dog, or let's say a young boy sees this giant warrior that walks out in front of him, and he feels this sense of mixture of fear, of being impressed, and of wanting something from that, or like wanting to move up towards that,
yeah. Well, I think we talked about this in relationship to the night sky. There's a very famous image of Mary that Renaissance artists really went to town on. There's hundreds of paintings of this. So it's Mary with her head in the stars and her foot on a serpent. So it's that serpent is the serpent in the Garden of Eden, or Satan, or evil. And the idea there, it's an image of the divine feminine. And the idea is that in order to protect the vulnerable from evil, you have to be oriented to the highest that the cosmos has to offer.